You know how sometimes you'll have a random crazy thought in the middle of the night? Well, I remembered that guy I bought my old Junker Elsinore 125 from also had a 1978 or 79 CR250 stuffed in the back of his old building. So, the thought popped into my head, I wonder if he still has that, and I wonder if he'd sell it. It's been 2 years since I saw it, but I messaged him and he still had it. And he said he'd sell it to me for $500. So I went over there and picked it up. When I actually got the bike, it wasn't quite as complete as I remembered it. I thought I remembered it having a gas tank and a seat. It was also missing the airbox, CDI and coil, and some other expensive stuff like the rear brake pedal and brake arm. But the engine and pipe were there, and that alone was worth well more than $500. Though some of the engine was looking a little rough too. The cylinder has been sleeved, and something has been living in the reed cage, so I wasn't quite sure what to do with this bike. I already have a 1978 CR250 that I love. As I kept looking at the pictures of this old bike and thinking about how much it was going to cost to find another gas tank, a seat, airbox, and then fenders and all new plastics, I started to realize I really liked how the bike looks now, raw and minimal, and I really liked this line. So I started coming up with other ideas. Maybe I'll do something completely different with this bike and turn it into a rat bike. I'll call it the Ratt Rocket. I'm a vintage MX purist, and I know other vintage purists, vintage snobs, will hate this bike. That's okay, but being a purist myself, I made a deal with my snobby side. I would make this a unique rat bike, but I would not cut or alter any of the original parts. That way, later, if I don't like this build, I can easily restore it to a nice 1979 CR250 MX bike. I had some ideas, so I started ordering some parts so I could hold them up to the bike and see if I liked where my mind was going. A stainless steel radiator canister from a car would become the gas tank. I found a seat and some aluminum LED light brackets that would become the seat mounts. When I looked closely at the frame, I noticed somebody in the past 40 years has taken a huge endo and the subframe was bent. To straighten this, I put a wood block here and pounded another wood block here with a 3-pound hammer, which brought the right side back up to level. Some of the things you find on these old bikes are just crazy. Looks like whoever rode this bike tried to squeeze an extra 18 or 20 years out of this chain roller. I stripped the frame down and inspected and bagged all the parts. At first, I was very happy this bike actually had the original carb. None of the other bikes I've restored even had a carb. But the happy rush was short-lived, kind of like a one-beer buzz. The float bowl chamber was total toast. So, rather than deal with a headache, I'll just buy a new carb. This is how a restoration project can start becoming a money pit. Passion usually wins, though. When I started digging into the engine, I was thinking money pit again. The top end and crank were not looking good at all. A lot of gunk and rust damage, which is typical of somebody trying to work on it, then rolling it behind the shed without putting the spark plug back in it. Then it fills up with water. The flywheel was absolutely the most stuck I've had to deal with. So I soaked it with WD-40 overnight. Then heated the crank spindle with a torch and tapped the flywheel with a rubber hammer. Eventually it came off. With the flywheel off, I started splitting the cases, and it literally looked like somebody had been trying to smuggle coke in this engine. Hey, well, maybe I could sell this coke to help pay for this engine rebuild. I pulled everything out, and the main bearings were just toast, and unfortunately the crank too. I cleaned it up with the cheap man's vapor blast to see what was actually there, and the surfaces where the crank seals ride were severely pitted from rust damage. I could sleeve these, but I looked on eBay and luckily found another crank that was clean and much less expensive than rebuilding and resleeving this old crank. Fortunately, everything inside the clutch and transmission looked great, totally sealed away from the crank area and coated in oil. When I rebuild these old bikes, I always put all the original bolts and pieces that get replaced in tubs, so I can go back to them if I need to. This is from the bike I'm working on now. This is from the 1985 KX125 I recently finished. Even the old spoke nipples. And this is from the 1978 CR250 restore. The piston in this bike is pretty dinged up, but I can see it is a 50 over piston, so I ordered a new version of that size. Here is a look at the old crank bearing and a new one. The transmission goes back together with the replacement crank, new crank bearings, and all new engine seals. The frame and the other pieces are painted and clear coated with a super hard epoxy. I wanted to use the original steel clutch plates, but when I started cleaning them up, they were very pitted too, and would grind up new fiber plates like sandpaper. So I had to order new steel plates, as well as new fiber plates. After just touching the old fiber plates, my fingers were coated in a mess that felt like sand and oil. The engine parts were painted, the pipe was sanded and painted. It has a few dents, but it's the original pipe and it's solid. I found some aluminum ring mounts for the stainless gas tank. These mount the tank right up cleanly without having to drill the frame in any way. A simple, clean, industrial look. Here's the seat I found. And the brackets I found to use as seat mounts work perfectly. Clean looking and sturdy. This was all a guess when I bought this stuff online, and it's worked out well. To lower the rear end, I just took the springs off the shocks and let them sink to the lowest position. That gives me that straight line I was envisioning in the earlier picture. The forks were cleaned, flushed, and rebuilt with new seals. These forks are in excellent shape and feel smooth. These would be great for vintage MX, actually. Each fork has two seals stacked together. They give me the clean look I wanted. The rebuilt engine was mounted back in the frame. The new or replacement crank and rod are smooth with the new bearings. The shifter and kickstarter go back on. I rebuilt the kickstarter with a bolt and nut since the lower starter threads were stripped, and I had to be careful of the clearance here, so I used a thin nut. I found a new ball and spring at the hardware store. This bike was missing the CDI, the wiring harness, and the coil. I found a CDI from a 1981 CR250. It has the same wiring as this bike, so hopefully it will work. The coil is from a 1989 RM250, so I had to make some mounts for both of these odd ignition parts, and had to extend the wiring to make the connection to the flywheel wiring. I've tested it. It does spark. We'll see if the timing is right later. The new piston came in, 50 over. It fits perfectly. I'll check the rings too. Now onto the reed cage. This is looking pretty rough, really rough. I'll clean it up though and see what's there. Steel wire just isn't getting enough of this rust off, and I don't want any rust chunks blowing through the newly rebuilt engine. So I'll soak these pieces in a 50-50 vinegar and water mixture for 3 days. Yeah, this is looking much better. I believe these stainless steel reeds are original Honda parts from 1979. They cleaned up nicely and seem to be in great shape, no cracks. I got all new bolts and lock washers. One of the reeds had a gap between the blocks, so I flipped it over and it lays nice and flat now. So, this reed block is looking much better than it was.
One of the frustrating things about this bike is a lot of the small and hard to find pieces are missing, like this clutch cable perch, and I haven't been able to find one, but I did see a perch that looked kind of similar on eBay, so I went ahead and ordered it for about 12 bucks, and I'm going to try it and see if it works. It may not work. Yeah, it looks like this is not going to work. Kind of needs to be right here. I guess I could trim this off, shave this off and try it. Then I'll end up ruining this part if it doesn't work. That's why it's so nice to, if you find an old vintage bike that is complete, it's such a plus. You're so far ahead of the game. Even if it doesn't run, if it has all of the parts where they're supposed to be, and a double bonus would be as if it hadn't been messed with a whole lot.
I thought about using something else and cutting it to fit, like the loop in this door hinge, but I just don't have the tools to do decent metal fab work here. Then I checked the auto parts store. Surely there is a carb throttle mount or something that I could easily convert to what I need. This looks like it might be perfect. And sure enough, when I got back to the shop, it was nearly perfect and looked unique. I just needed to bend it slightly and drill out holes for mounting bolts. So here it is. It mounted right up using bolt locations that were already in place on the engine. So this is where I am so far. Next I'll work on the wheels and getting it rolling. These old hard weather tires are a bitch to get off, so rather than busting knuckles all day, I just cut them off using a steel cutting blade to get through the steel bands. Obviously I'm very, very careful doing this and slip a steel iron under the blade when I get close to the rim. One cut into the rim will weaken it too much to use safely. Some parts on these vintage bikes require special tools, like this hubcap covering the wheel bearing. It's hard to justify buying a tool I'm likely to use only once or twice ever. So fortunately there are some workarounds, like the fork tool I made on my KX125 video. And here, to remove this cap, I'll just put two short 6mm bolts in the holes and spin this with a screwdriver. Done. I've been looking for a rear brake lever, but the ones I'm seeing are all in the $190 range. So I'm looking at some other options. I found this 1985 CR250 brake lever for $18. So for that price I thought I would try it and see what the fit was. Unfortunately, it's way too thick at the joint and wasn't going to work. Then I found this really interesting one from a 1970s Husky 250. I like that it looks so different, and it almost fits. Almost. So, with a little shaving, it fits well. When I started this rat bike project, I said I wouldn't alter any of the parts on this bike, so that I could put it back to a Red Rocket racer if I ever wanted to. Shaving down an old Husky part is still sort of breaking that code. But some guy parted that Husky out and sold this to me for 20 bucks. I'll sleep at night. I also borrowed this U connector from the 1985 pedal. This is where it all kind of got weird for me. I have always shopped for motocross knobbies, and here I was looking at street tires. I also have a habit of driving by the recycling bin at the trash dump. I have found some excellent knobbies here from MX Pros that only run tires for one race. Sometimes free is good. tap all the old bearings out. The front ones were not that bad, but the rear bearings were total toast. My opinion is, it's things like new bearings, bushings, and straight new bolts that bring a restoration bike back from a clapped out feeling old bike to more of a new, tight, and straight feeling bike. Somewhere back in time, somebody painted the rims and spokes with spray can paint. So my options were to stick with this or buy new rims and spokes, which would add another $600 to my budget. So I decided to clean these up and repaint them and clear coat them with this rock hard two-step coating. I like the look it leaves, a slight matte look totally sealed in rock hard armor. Again, I'm having to build the rear brake system completely from scratch. This is a brake arm from an early 80s XR500. I'll try it first. I was able to find this insert at Lowe's. It fits perfectly. Maybe my karma is good. A problem I have experienced with EBC brake pads for this bike is the pads don't fit the spindle well. These new pads just aren't cut deep enough here. They probably use the same metal base for several different vintage bikes, and the Honda spindle is larger, so I had to grind down the pads here to make them fit. Other parts start coming in. I ordered all the cables for an early 80s XR100, so they would be shorter and not looping up high, since the Cafe Racer type bars were low and flat. The whole rear brake area is coming together. For the brake stay, I cut and drilled a piece of box aluminum. Since the rear end is basically bottomed out constantly, I had to measure everything for this position and make sure the brake arm moves freely. I added a leather bag to cover the old rear frame brace and give the rear of the bike some balance visually. I can put tools in it, wallet, cell phone, Magnum condoms, or whatever. Using a shorter throttle cable from an XR100 didn't work out for me. I didn't take into account that the carb on an XR100 is really small, so I had to very carefully cut and unwind a couple of inches of the outer band of the cable. Then I looked closely at the cable with a magnifier to be sure I didn't fray any of the wires. I don't want to risk having the throttle hang up. All looks good. Putting the carb on was the last detail. It's a 36mm Mikuni. Here is the finished bike. Now I get to crank it, or try to crank it, and ride it. I always love that first startup after a build. I have no idea at all when this bike ran last. It's running now though. I love it. This build has been a seriously fun one. Not too expensive, $500 for the junker bike, and about $2,000 in new parts. I love what I've done with this bike. The lines, the whole look overall, and it's a fun one to ride. Obviously it's a pit cruiser or neighborhood cruiser, awesome for cruising around the infield at Daytona Bike Week, blowing past my neighbors cruising the neighborhood on their golf carts, maybe even take it to the local drag strip and let it scream. The 1979 Ratt Rocket. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.